By the late 3rd century BCE, Rome believed it had solved the problem of Carthage. The First Punic War was over. Sicily was lost to Rome. Carthage had been forced to pay a massive indemnity. Its navy, the foundation of its earlier power, was shattered. From a Roman perspective, Carthage was no longer an equal rival. It was a defeated state that could be managed, watched, and contained. That assessment was dangerously wrong. Carthage was not built like Rome, and it did not recover the way Rome expected. It was not a land empire, dependent on citizen legions and Italian manpower. It was a maritime commercial power with centuries of experience projecting force through money, contracts, and coalition warfare. Where Rome raised armies from its own population, Carthage raised armies by integrating foreign troops, North Africans, Iberians, Numidians, Gauls, into a single operational system. This was not a weakness. It was a skill refined over generations. After the First Punic War, Carthage pivoted west. Sicily was gone, but Iberia was rich. Southern Spain offered silver mines, agricultural surplus, manpower, and, critically, distance from direct Roman oversight. Beginning in the late 200s and 30s BCE, the Barcid family transformed Iberia into a new Carthaginian power base. Fortified cities were built. Local alliances were negotiated or coerced. Revenue flowed back to North Africa. Armies were trained and tested far from Roman interference. Rome noticed the activity, but underestimated its implications. The Roman Senate treated Iberia as a buffer zone, not a launch platform. Treaties were signed defining vague spheres of influence. Roman frontier commanders monitored the situation, but did not interfere aggressively. Rome expected any future war with Carthage to resemble the last one: slow, maritime, distant, and controllable. That assumption ignored the man being trained inside this system. Hannibal Barca did not emerge by accident. He was formed deliberately inside Carthage's recovered war machine. From a young age, he was embedded in Iberian campaigns where warfare looked nothing like the set-piece battles Rome preferred. He learned to manage multinational forces that did not share language, culture, or political loyalty. He learned how to hold coalitions together through success, discipline, and shared incentives rather than citizenship. If you keep watching, you'll see that nothing Hannibal later does in Italy is improvised. Every major element of his campaign, coalition command, long-distance logistics, psychological pressure, was practiced years earlier in Iberia. In Iberia, Hannibal is exposed to siege warfare, rapid maneuver, and operations conducted far from secure supply lines. Cities resist. Alliances shift. Tribal politics require constant negotiation. Victory depends not just on battlefield success, but on preventing fragmentation among allies. These conditions shape a commander who understands war as a system, not a sequence of battles. Carthage supports this development because it aligns with state strategy. The Barcid leadership is not rebuilding Carthaginian power for defense alone. Iberia provides the revenue and manpower to challenge Rome indirectly. Carthage cannot yet contest Roman naval dominance in the central Mediterranean, but it can threaten Rome's alliance network and manpower base if war comes again. That threat does not require fleets. It requires an army that can move independently, survive off mixed supply systems, and fight on unfamiliar ground. Hannibal becomes the product of that logic. By the time tensions escalate toward open war, Carthage has rebuilt much of its strategic capacity, not in ships, but in men, money, and command experience. Rome sees a resurgent Carthaginian presence in Iberia, but misjudges its tempo. Roman leadership assumes that any new war will begin on the periphery, with time to mobilize and respond. What Rome fails to grasp is that Carthage has already trained a commander who understands how to collapse distance bypass expectations, and turn a regional confrontation into an existential crisis. The Second Punic War does not begin as a reckless gamble by a single general. It begins as the execution phase of a long recovery strategy, one that Rome notices too late. By the time Hannibal takes command, Carthage is no longer rebuilding. It is ready. The war begins where Rome expects it to begin, along the edges of its influence in Iberia, but it does not stay there for long. When fighting breaks out, Roman planners assume the conflict will follow a familiar pattern. Carthage will defend its overseas holdings. Rome will send armies and fleets to pressure them. Campaign seasons will be measured. Distance will buy time. That expectation shapes Rome's initial deployments and its sense of urgency. Hannibal has no intention of fighting that war. The army he assembles in Iberia reflects years of preparation rather than a rushed mobilization. It is a coalition force, deliberately mixed and already blooded. North African infantry form the disciplined core. Iberian contingents add numbers and local combat experience. Numidian cavalry provide speed, scouting, and shock value unmatched by Roman horsemen. The army does not share a single language or culture, which makes command harder. But Hannibal has already learned how to manage that complexity. He has done it in Iberia, under pressure, with real consequences for failure. What limits this army is not fighting ability. It is supply. Hannibal cannot rely on steady resupply from Carthage once he leaves Iberia. He cannot assume friendly territory ahead. That constraint forces the central strategic decision of the campaign. Instead of fighting Rome where Rome is strongest, on the sea or near its Italian bases, Hannibal will bring the war to Italy itself before Rome can fully react. The route he chooses is not symbolic. It is functional. Marching along the coast would expose the army to Roman naval interception. Moving through southern Italy by sea would require fleets Carthage no longer controls. The only remaining option is overland, through southern Gaul and across the Alps. It is the most difficult path available, but it bypasses Roman expectations and Roman defenses entirely. The march north through Gaul is already a campaign of diplomacy and violence combined. Some tribes resist, others negotiate. Hannibal alternates force and restraint depending on what keeps the army moving. River crossings are contested. Rear guards are attacked. Supplies are seized or traded for under pressure. Losses accumulate, but cohesion holds. By the time the army reaches the Alpine foothills, it is already smaller than when it left Iberia. Hannibal knows this. He proceeds anyway. The Alpine crossing is not a single dramatic moment. It is a sequence of problems that compound over time. Narrow passes restrict movement. Weather shifts rapidly. Local groups harass the column from above. Animals slip, fall, and die. Equipment is lost. Men freeze, starve, or break down physically. The army bleeds strength every day it remains in the mountains. But the crossing achieves its purpose. When Hannibal emerges into northern Italy, Rome's strategic planning collapses. Roman armies had been positioned to fight in Iberia or along the coast. Instead, a hostile force appears inside Italy itself, among communities whose loyalty Rome depends on. The shock is not just military, it is political. Hannibal's army is battered, but it is alive, coherent, and dangerous. Most importantly, it has seized the initiative. Rome must now respond on his terms, not its own. Every Roman decision becomes reactive. Every campaign must account for Hannibal's presence rather than pursue long-term objectives. The march does not weaken Hannibal's campaign. It defines it. By forcing Rome to fight where it least expects and least prepares for, Hannibal transforms the war from a distant struggle into a domestic emergency. The Alps are not a backdrop to his legend. They are the mechanism that makes the entire campaign possible. What follows is not a single battle, but a pattern, one in which Roman aggression, confidence, and doctrine are turned against Rome itself. Rome responds the way Rome always has, by doing what worked before. Consuls raise new armies quickly. Allied contingents are summoned. Commanders are instructed to seek battle and destroy the invading force before it can destabilize Italy any further. The assumption is simple and deeply ingrained. A foreign army operating far from home cannot sustain pressure if it is forced into a decisive engagement. Hannibal understands that assumption perfectly. He builds his entire operational approach around exploiting it. The first clash comes near the Trebia River in northern Italy. Roman forces advance aggressively, eager to engage before Hannibal can recover from the Alpine crossing. Hannibal allows them to believe they have the initiative. He draws them forward in cold weather, across a swollen river, knowing fatigue and exposure will weaken discipline before the fighting even begins. His deployment is layered and deceptive. Light troops harass. The main infantry holds. Hidden forces strike Roman flanks at the moment of commitment. The result is a sharp defeat that shocks Roman commanders but does not yet break their confidence. Rome tells itself this is an accident, weather, poor judgment, a mistake that can be corrected. The next year proves otherwise. Near Lake Trasimene, Hannibal executes one of the most complete battlefield ambushes in recorded history. He chooses terrain deliberately, a narrow corridor between the lake and surrounding hills, perfect for trapping an advancing army. His troops occupy the high ground in silence before dawn. When the Roman column enters the pass, visibility is limited by morning fog. There is no warning, no orderly deployment. The attack comes from multiple directions at once. The Roman army is effectively destroyed. Thousands are killed. Their commander dies in the fighting. Survivors are scattered or captured. The psychological impact is enormous. For the first time, Rome confronts the reality that its legions can be annihilated in the field by design, not chance. Panic spreads through Italy. Allied communities begin reassessing their position. Rome appoints a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose strategy is built around avoiding exactly the kind of battles Hannibal wants. But pressure from Roman political culture and public fear soon pushes the Republic back toward confrontation. That confrontation comes at Cannae. Rome assembles one of the largest armies it has ever fielded. The logic is brute force. Overwhelm Hannibal with numbers. Break his army in a single, crushing engagement. Restore confidence. Reassert dominance. The Roman formation is deep and aggressive, designed to punch through an enemy center by sheer mass. Hannibal anticipates this completely. At Cannae, his deployment is subtle rather than spectacular. His center is deliberately flexible, composed of troops who can give ground without breaking. His strongest infantry anchors the wings. His cavalry, particularly on one flank, outmatches Rome's horse decisively. When the battle begins, the Roman infantry advances exactly as planned, pushing into the Carthaginian center as it slowly retreats. This is not collapse. It is controlled movement. As the Roman mass presses forward, Hannibal's wings hold firm. His cavalry sweeps the Roman horse from the field and then turns inward. The Roman army, tightly packed and committed, loses room to maneuver. Pressure builds from the sides, then from behind. What began as an advance becomes compression. Formation becomes confinement. By the time Roman commanders understand what is happening, there is no space left to fix it. The encirclement closes. Thousands of Roman soldiers are trapped in a killing zone where numbers become a liability rather than an advantage. Command collapses. Units cannot maneuver or retreat. Casualties mount rapidly. By the end of the day, a Roman field army has been effectively annihilated. The scale of the defeat is unprecedented. Tens of thousands are dead. Senior officers are killed. Italy watches as the myth of Roman invincibility fractures in real time. The consequences go beyond the battlefield. Cities in southern Italy defect. Rome's alliance network begins to strain. For the first time, the survival of the Roman state itself appears uncertain. Hannibal has not merely won battles. He has altered the strategic balance of the war. Rome is no longer dictating events. It is struggling to contain them. What makes this sequence of defeats so dangerous is not just their severity, but their consistency. Hannibal does not win once. He wins repeatedly, under different conditions, against different commanders, using varied methods. This forces Rome to confront an uncomfortable truth. Its traditional way of war no longer guarantees security. At this point, Rome stands at a crossroads: continue seeking decisive battle and risk extinction, or abandon its instincts and fight a kind of war it has never preferred. Hannibal has done everything a commander can do to break a rival state from the field. What happens next will depend less on his genius than on whether Rome can survive long enough to change itself. After Cannae, Rome's survival depends less on battlefield performance than on institutional control. The Senate understands that another attempt at decisive engagement could permanently cripple the Republic's ability to field armies at all. Losses on the scale already suffered cannot be repeated indefinitely, even with Rome's unusually deep manpower pool. The immediate response is not dramatic, but administrative. Command authority is tightened. Recruitment quotas are restructured. Younger and older age brackets are mobilized. Debt is deferred. Religious and civic rituals are adjusted to stabilize morale. But the most important change is operational. Roman armies are no longer ordered to seek Hannibal out. The strategic framework associated with Quintus Fabius Maximus becomes the default approach rather than a temporary deviation. Roman forces are instructed to track Hannibal's movements at distance, occupy defensible terrain, and attack only when conditions strongly favor them. Detachments target supply parties, scouts, and isolated units. Crops are destroyed in areas Hannibal is expected to traverse. Movement is slowed, not stopped, with the aim of exhausting his logistical flexibility rather than confronting his army directly. This approach produces immediate friction inside Rome's political culture. Avoiding battle contradicts long-standing ideals of courage and honor tied to direct confrontation. Senators fear appearing weak. Allied communities question Rome's confidence. But the effects on the ground are undeniable. Roman armies remain intact. Casualties drop sharply. Time, which had worked against Rome during Hannibal's rapid victories, begins to reverse direction. Hannibal's constraints become more visible as the war drags on. His army remains tactically superior in open battle, but it operates inside enemy territory without a permanent administrative structure. Hannibal cannot collect taxes, enforce laws, or compel long-term obedience. Garrisons are thin. Control is temporary and dependent on continued success. Every failed attempt to draw Rome into battle weakens his leverage over Italian communities watching the conflict. Logistics become a growing problem. Hannibal's army relies on a combination of foraging, negotiated supply, and seasonal movement. Roman countermeasures disrupt all three. Fortified towns refuse access. Roman patrols shadow movements closely. Hannibal is forced to maneuver constantly to keep his army fed, which limits his ability to concentrate force for decisive action. Most importantly, Hannibal lacks the tools to attack Rome itself. The city's fortifications, population, and supply reserves make siege impractical without massive reinforcements and specialized equipment. Even after catastrophic defeats, Rome can still field new armies and defend its capital. Hannibal understands this reality and focuses instead on breaking Rome's alliance network. But that network proves more resilient than anticipated. Rome exploits this resilience systematically. Italian communities that remain loyal receive protection, favorable terms, and visible support. Those that defect are isolated and punished once Hannibal moves on. Roman forces avoid overextension, retaking territory gradually rather than risking decisive engagements. Hostages, garrisons, and negotiated settlements reinforce political control. Over time, defection becomes less attractive, as Rome demonstrates it can still enforce consequences. At the same time, the war expands beyond Italy by design. Roman leadership identifies Iberia as the critical pressure point. Carthage's ability to sustain Hannibal depends on revenue, manpower, and experienced commanders drawn from the Iberian sphere built by the Barcid family. Roman campaigns there focus on dismantling that system rather than chasing Hannibal himself. Cities are taken, alliances are broken, mines and recruitment centers are seized. Each success reduces Carthage's capacity to support operations in Italy. Internal divisions within Carthage exacerbate the problem. The Barcid leadership does not fully control state policy. Resources are allocated unevenly across multiple theaters, including Sicily and North Africa. Political caution limits the scale and speed of reinforcements sent to Hannibal. His army, though still effective, becomes increasingly isolated from the broader Carthaginian war effort. Out of this environment emerges a new Roman command style, shaped by necessity rather than tradition. The most prominent figure is Scipio Africanus, whose approach reflects lessons learned from Hannibal rather than from Rome's earlier doctrine. Scipio avoids predictable deployments, adapts to local conditions, and targets strategic resources rather than symbolic victories. His campaigns in Iberia accelerate the erosion of Carthaginian power. By the time Rome carries the war into North Africa, the strategic balance has already shifted. Hannibal remains undefeated in Italy, but his presence no longer determines the outcome. Carthage is forced onto the defensive. The initiative lies with Rome, not because it has beaten Hannibal in battle, but because it has removed his ability to shape the war's direction. This phase of the conflict explains why Hannibal's campaign, despite its unprecedented battlefield success, does not culminate in Roman collapse. Rome survives by abandoning its preferred method of war and adopting a strategy centered on endurance, resource denial, and political control. Once that shift occurs, Hannibal's advantages diminish steadily. He remains a threat. He remains respected, but the war is no longer being fought on his terms. The final phase of the war does not unfold in Italy. It ends where the balance of power can finally be decided, on Carthaginian soil. By the early 200s BCE, Roman strategy has achieved its primary objective. Hannibal remains active in Italy, but his presence no longer dictates Roman decision-making. The Carthaginian state is under increasing strain. Iberia, once the financial and manpower engine of the Barcid war effort, has largely fallen to Roman control. Revenues that once funded Hannibal's army are gone. Recruitment pipelines are severed. Experienced commanders are dead, captured, or isolated. Rome now has the freedom to escalate. The Senate authorizes a direct campaign against North Africa, forcing Carthage into a defensive posture it has not faced since the First Punic War. This decision is not driven by confidence alone. It is calculated. Roman leadership understands that as long as Hannibal operates in Italy, he remains dangerous, but only if Carthage can continue supporting him. Attacking the Carthaginian homeland forces a choice: protect the state or continue a distant war. Carthage recalls Hannibal. After more than a decade in Italy, he returns to Africa under fundamentally different conditions than when he left Iberia years earlier. He is no longer leading a confident expeditionary force, drawing strength from victory and momentum. He now commands an army assembled hurriedly from local levies, recent recruits, and limited veteran contingents. The quality gap between his earlier Italian army and this force is significant. The decisive engagement takes place near Zama, against a Roman army led by Scipio Africanus. Both commanders understand what is at stake. Hannibal faces the first major battle of his career without overwhelming cavalry superiority or a hardened veteran coalition. Scipio, having studied Hannibal's methods for years, structures his army to neutralize the tactics that once devastated Roman legions. The battle is hard-fought and disciplined rather than dramatic. Hannibal's deployment reflects experience and restraint. Scipio's reflects preparation and adaptation. When the fighting ends, it is Rome that holds the field. Carthage has no capacity to continue the war. The peace settlement that follows strips Carthage of its strategic independence. It loses the right to wage war without Roman permission. Its fleet is dismantled. Its territories are reduced. The city remains, but as a subordinate power. Rome emerges as the dominant force in the Western Mediterranean, with no rival capable of challenging it at scale. Hannibal's campaign ends in defeat, but the historical question is not whether he lost. It is how close Rome came to collapse before adapting. Ancient sources allow this assessment with unusual clarity. Polybius, writing within living memory of the war, provides a detailed, analytical account of Roman and Carthaginian strategy, logistics, and political decision-making. His work emphasizes cause and consequence rather than moral storytelling, making it indispensable for understanding how the war actually functioned. Livy, writing later, preserves additional traditions and perspectives, though often framed through Roman moral values. When read together and cross-checked, the sources consistently support the same core conclusions. Hannibal repeatedly destroyed Roman field armies. He destabilized Rome's alliance network. He forced the Republic into emergency political and military reforms. Rome altered recruitment practices, command structures, and strategy under pressure that no previous enemy had sustained for so long. These are measurable facts, not rhetorical claims. What Hannibal ultimately lacked was not battlefield skill, but structural leverage. He could defeat Roman armies, but he could not replace Roman institutions. He could exploit weaknesses, but he could not permanently dismantle Rome's political system. Rome's survival depended less on heroism than on endurance. Its ability to absorb loss, adapt strategy, and fight a war of resources rather than pride. This is why Hannibal remains central to military study. His campaign demonstrates how operational audacity, coalition management, deception, and combined arms can produce repeated tactical victories against a larger state. It also demonstrates the limits of those victories when they cannot be converted into administrative control or sustained strategic dominance. Rome did not survive because Hannibal failed. It survived because it changed. And that change, forced by a North African general who brought war to Italy itself, reshaped Mediterranean history for centuries to come.